Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jaw and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We're finally getting around to talking about Microsoft's Digital Defense Report for 2023. This was released a few months ago in October, and it's the fourth annual Digital Defense Report. So Microsoft has been putting this out for a few years, and this particular one has data, insights, and events that are from July 2022 through June of 2023. So they kind of take the last, say, fiscal year of Microsoft and look at all that data, put together a report, and then they put it out in the fall. So some of the information may be a little bit dated just because if you're putting out a massive report like this, it's hard to get extremely up-to-date stuff in here. But nevertheless, there's a lot of really good insights, a lot of good takeaways, a lot of good things that you can do for your organization to make it more secure by understanding some of the things in this report. So first and foremost, Adam and I do work for Microsoft. If you're a listener of the show, we work in our security business. We don't have anything to do with this report specifically, but one of the callouts in the report is just how much Microsoft is investing into security research, innovation, and the global security community as a whole. This number keeps on growing from year to year, but right now we have about 65 trillion signals that are being synthesized daily. And that's just signals that are part of data analytics, AI algorithms to understand and protect against digital threats and the criminal cyber activity. So that's almost 750 million signals per second. The other thing we have, and again, this number keeps on growing. The last time I saw this was around 7,500. Now it's over 10,000 security and threat intelligence experts across the globe. That includes engineers, researchers, data scientists, cybersecurity experts, threat hunters, geopolitical analysts, investigators, and frontline responders. Our identity stack blocks 4,000 identity attacks per second. And our threat intelligence has grown to track more than 300 unique threat actors, including 160 nation-state actors, 50,000 ransomware groups, and hundreds of other cyber criminals. And then this one I found pretty interesting because Microsoft has email, we have insight into domains. As part of the cybercrimes unit, Microsoft has removed over 100,000 domains that have been utilized by cyber criminals, including over 600 employed by nation-state threats. So that's pretty cool to be a part of that organization that is really contributing all that to the cybersecurity community.
I often present these numbers to customers. We actually have a slide that's part of multiple security presentations, and I call it the large numbers slide. But what it does establish, especially for folks who often come at it from the view of Microsoft's not really a security company, is it does help establish not only is Microsoft just a partner in the security space, but is a major player. And what enables Microsoft to be successful in the security space is that breadth and depth, that visibility into signals, 65 trillion signals per day. That number, you did it the other way, Andy. You broke it down per second. But if you extrapolate it out per month, it becomes something that's measured in, and I had to look this up. What's the next one? It's quadrillion is the next set of numbers after trillion is quadrillion. It becomes something quadrillion signals per month. And it's just, again, you can't even comprehend that scale. And then the other number, just to point out, and you said this has grown, I agree. I remember when that number was 7,500, 8,500. Just keep in mind, it was a little over, probably now in the rearview mirror of about 8 to 9 months ago, Microsoft just completed laying off over 10,000 people from the company and really did not do a lot of hiring at all. In a lot of organizations, we are asked to kind of make do with seats that weren't backfilled, where we didn't have a person working in them. And so the fact that the security business has still grown over the last year compared to the rest of the company that shrunk overall. That was announced in our most recent earnings call, that the headcount had shrunk year over year, and that there was not a lot of hiring going on, but security still hired and still grew significantly. Just shows where Microsoft is pivoting its investment. Sure, you're hearing a lot about AI from Microsoft with good reason, but this also emphasizes security is still a very important part of what Microsoft does today.
This wasn't on the show notes, but I do really like this section of the report. So if you get a chance to read through it, there's a section on building partnerships as part of cyber resilience. And if you read through this, it's really interesting because it's something that I was actually a part of in previous organizations. So individual organizations are often focused on safeguarding their own data and systems and protecting their customers, constituents, and communities. But if you bring in partnerships with other organizations, you can be like a force multiplier. And that includes, not only government agencies, but also private, sector, academia, nonprofits. And I think this concept that they talk about here with the cyber poverty line is a really interesting concept because, Adam, you have really talked about on the show that your concern is small and medium businesses. And I think a lot of those would be what I consider below the cyber poverty line, right? They don't have the resources. They don't have the tools. They don't have the expertise to maintain proper cyber hygiene, proper cyber security. And so I think using collaboration with other organizations. I'll give you an example. When I was working at Trek Bikes, the CISO, or the director of security at the time, had a really good relationship with the director of security at Kohler. And so as a partnership, and there was another one, SE Johnson. And as a part of that kind of triad, all manufacturing organizations, all in Wisconsin, we had a good relationship where we would share intel and resources. So we had a agreement, and this was all vetted through legal and HR, where if one organization was attacked, they could request resources from the other organization, and we would go and help them. And we also shared training. Like I went to Kohler as a Trek employee to participate in training that they put on. And I formed some good relationships there that I haven't maintained over the years, but still, like, I'm connected with them on LinkedIn, and every now and then I'll see things that they post. And so I think that type of thinking more out of the box, and this was many years ago, I think that is fairly novel and doesn't really happen these days. You don't really hear about that among private industry, maybe among some non-government, nonprofit organizations or government entities having some partnerships, but certainly not among just the regular private sectors. And I think those connections can be really important, and having some sort of thing where you are similar organizations, maybe healthcare organizations within the same geographical location, can kind of come together and talk shop and figure out strategies and what are you doing to prevent stuff. Maybe we can do something better, right? And sharing ideas. So, anyways, I thought that was a really cool part of the report. It talks about this partnership, and definitely worth reading about here.
I had no clue. I covered Kohler and SE Johnson for years as some of my Microsoft customers, and they had never mentioned that, but that's interesting. I know there's a lot of pride in being a Wisconsin-based manufacturer, and it was really a point of local pride and statewide pride that you have such a robust business community there. And it makes sense they would align and work together. And I know the gal who led security at Kohler, I'm not sure if she's still there, but was really an out-of-the-box thinker. So I'm not surprised to hear of innovative thinking like that. And I think that's a great idea, as much as possible, where you're not necessarily competitive, but you have some commonalities. how can we work together to strengthen all of ourselves? And I think we talk about that a lot in terms of cloud-centric security, where the cloud helps lift because there's more visibility, there's more understanding, better chance of discovering those proverbial needles in the haystack. But you can still do that at a more micro level too, amongst your peer organizations and your local communities. So that's really great to hear. And more than just like, oh, well, we all go show up to the same security meetup, which is valuable too. I'm not being dismissive of it, but getting to the point of actual limited talent sharing and intelligence sharing is on a higher level, and that it was actually vetted and approved for legal. Very, very cool. I love hearing about stuff like that.
So going back to the defense report, there's 5 major sections. The first one is state of cybercrime. The second one is nation-state threats. The third one is critical cybersecurity challenges. Fourth one is innovating for security and resilience. And then the 5 is collective defense. And so we'll talk over some of these. The report is massive. There's also an executive summary if you just want some of the highlights. But for our listeners and the defenders out there, I think the 2 main ones that we're going to go through tonight are the state of cybercrime and critical cybersecurity challenges. I think those 2 are going to be the most important. If you're in threat intelligence and you want to know about nation-state threats, obviously there's some comprehensive reporting here. And then the innovative security and resilience, there's some takeaways there that can be important. And the collective defense is more on government and policy and just coming together as a cybersecurity community, what we can do. But I think if you're looking at specific things on the trends and takeaways that you can go back and check your security policies at your companies, the state of cybercrime and the critical cybersecurity challenges are the 2 major sections that I would highly recommend to actually go through and read in full in this digital defense report, which will obviously have a link in the show notes for you. So the first thing that I want to talk about is there's a slide in here, a section that talks about how can we protect against 99% of attacks. And there's 5 major pillars of fundamental cyber hygiene. For anyone who's been a listener of the show, these should come as no surprise. If you're new to cybersecurity, these are the things that you should focus on. And really, if you're trying to stand up a cybersecurity program, these are the first 5 things that you need to go through. So the first one is enable multi-factor. No shocker here. The second one is apply zero trust principles. And when we say that, we don't want to just give it lip service. There are 3 major principles of zero trust principles, and it's explicitly verify, use least privileged access, and assume breach. So those 3 things, that means, policies like allowing devices to not have MFA while on a specific IP address, that's not really zero trust. So you want to think about each one of your policies, reevaluate them if they've been around for a while, and institute the zero trust policies. The third one is use extended detection and response, or XDR, and anti-malware. Again, pretty basic there. Keeping systems up to date. Number 4, obviously this is a very basic tenet, but one of the hardest things to achieve for most organizations. Having a vulnerability management program, keeping things patched and up to date. Unpatched and out-of-date systems are one of the biggest reasons why organizations fall victim to attacks. So make sure that the systems are up to date, and that includes firmware. We'll talk about firmware on OT and IoT devices in a different section, but those are the ones as well that you need to keep up to date, as well as applications, not just operating systems, right? Like your browser, you need to have a patching system. And ideally, you just let it update on its own and take that out of your patch cycle. But I know that sometimes can be difficult if there's a specific application that you use that's critical to your organization that doesn't work in a specific version of a browser. Those are things that need to be evaluated as risk to your company if you can't keep your applications and systems up to date due to a critical process that the company's using. That's inherent risk that needs to be brought up. And then finally, protecting data. That means knowing where your important data is, where it's located, and the right defenses. Last week we talked with our compliance folks, Carly and Megan, and we talked a lot about protecting data. This is the fifth tenet, right? And I think this is going to be one of the most important ones going forward, especially in the large language model, LLM, AI, boom. People who have done their due diligence in protecting data will sleep a little better at night, because protecting data in LLMs is really no different than protecting data without it. So those are the 5 main pillars that will protect against 99% of attacks.
And it does sound like we're repeating ourselves a lot, but if everyone was doing these things, we'd talk about something else. So the multi-factor authentication, that horse is very dead on this show, so we'll move on. The zero trust principles, Andy, the one you called out that's a common example, but orgs still do this all the time, are to say things like, well, you don't have to do MFA if you're on the corporate network. And then you talked about zero trust principles, explicitly verify, least privileged access, and assume breach. Well, that breaks at least 2 of those principles when you allow that, because number one, you're not explicitly verifying the multi-factor, you're assuming, and you're not assuming breach because you're assuming your internal network is safe. If you assume threat actors are in my internal network right now, then there's no way in heck you should give everyone a pass on MFA, because that gives you the attackers a pass on MFA. That's where that assume breach mindset comes from, is you start thinking like, well, we should not architect it that way, because if someone's already inside, this gives them a free pass forward. That's the kind of things we're talking about. And it is truly that mindset shift, but we have to get there. And so that's a big part of this. The EDR, whatever. Keep up to date. We've talked about a lot in this show. Obviously, it continues to be a struggle. I think this gets easier over time as you loosen the reins on some things to focus your energy on other things. Like Andy talked about, if you can get out of the business of having to patch your web browsers and just let them auto update, then you can focus more energy on things that don't update well or don't update at all on their own. When you're spinning your wheels updating browsers, especially with how frequently they get patched and with how much attack surface they represent, that's just not a good use of your energy. So, that's something we can and have talked about in other shows, but it keeps coming up. And agree with you on protect data. When we talked to Carly and Megan last week, this is one of the very first things they called out, is you have to know your data. You have to know your data. If you don't even know what you have, then you don't know how to protect it. You don't know how to build a taxonomy for it. And I agree with you, Andy. This is one of those things. My very first job at Microsoft, from the moment I set foot inside the company, was selling Azure Information Protection. So it's near and dear to my heart, as that has evolved over time to become Microsoft Information Protection and Purview Information Protection. I've talked to a ton of customers about this, and the interest in it ebbs and flows with time. There's a ton of interest in it right now because, to your point, this helps get you Copilot ready or LLM ready moving forward. And the organizations that have already done their homework, they're ready to go. They're ready for Copilot because they don't have to go figure out like, oh, is there oversharing over here? Is the risk of data leakage over there? They already know where the crown jewels are. They already know they have protective measures in place, and so they're able to move forward. So if you implement these 5 things, you are really setting yourself up to be successful moving forward.
All right, so let's talk about the state of cybercrime.
All right.
And there are some interesting numbers here. 80 to 90% of all successful ransomware compromises originate from unmanaged devices. That's huge. So these are some numbers that are from the report themselves. 70% of organizations encountering human-operated ransomware had fewer than 500 employees.
Hello.
You want to talk about small, medium business there?
There it is, right there.
Exactly. And so that's where I think the beginning of the report talks about that collaboration. We're seeing it here. 70% of orgs that had human operating ransomware were less than 500 employees. So, and then human operated ransomware attacks are up more than 200% over year to year. And then some insights on the ransomware. notable change from last year, Microsoft observed a sharp increase in the use of remote encryption. I found this was really interesting in human-operated ransomware. Instead of deploying a malicious file on the victim's device, the encryption is done remotely, with the system process performing the encryption, which renders process-based remediation ineffective. On average, 60% of human-operated ransomware used remote encryption over the past year, and this is a sign that attackers are evolving to further minimize their footprint. Found that that's a really interesting change in tactic, where they're not encrypting the data locally on the device. They're doing it through the internet, which I'm not exactly sure how the technical things work for that.
I'm curious too. Yeah.
Yeah. But it is definitely a change. And then the initial attack vector, I obviously, like when you're looking at ransomware, you want to find out what the next initial attack vector is. The top three are external remote services, which are unsecured RDP and VPN, valid accounts, where the attackers gained legitimate account credentials somehow, and then publicly facing applications like exploiting vulnerabilities from 0 days to some that were 2 to 3 years old, from like Managed Engine, Exchange, Move It was a big one this year. Those are some top ones. And so when we're looking at ransomware, in the report, there's 5 foundations of ransomware elimination. And this can be solution agnostic. So modern authentication with phish-resistant credentials, at least, at the bare minimum, do this for your admins. That should have been done yesterday. And then least privileged access applied across the entire technology stack, threat and risk-free environments. That's easier said than done, obviously. But the next one being posture management for compliance and health of devices, services, and assets. So cloud security posture management, device management, assets and services as well. So you should have continuous attestation of those things. And then finally, automatic cloud backup file syncing for user and business critical data. Something like OneDrive for Business, where it has multiple versioning built in and you can recover. There's an SLA when it comes to specifically ransomware attacks. So it doesn't have to be OneDrive for Business. It could be something else like Dropbox or Box or whatever your cloud provider of choice is. But you should have some sort of cloud backup. That way, the onus is on the cloud. Although, I will say, not to knock anyone, because the risk, obviously, when it comes to a cloud provider, is you are putting that trust in that cloud provider to have that backup. And I did read recently where Google Drive actually lost data for months. I don't know if you saw that, Adam, where users lost a bunch of their data. So obviously there's a risk there when you're doing that. So maintain, kind of spread out your risk if need be. If your one cloud provider isn't, where you want to put all your eggs in one basket, maybe have backup. But then you also look at your footprint. Adam talks about often where if you have multiple copies of your data in places, now you're increasing the footprint of that risk as well. So there's all sorts of things you need to evaluate when it comes to data, but definitely part of your strategy should be a cloud-based backup.
You want to talk about the identity attacks first, and then I'll talk about all of it? Yeah.
Yeah. And then finally, identity attacks were a big part of the cybercrime as well in 2023. So password-based attacks spiked, and MFA fatigue is continuing to be a threat. Microsoft measures about 6,000 MFA fatigue attempts observed per day across their entire identity suite. Token replay also remains a prevalent threat, which doubled last year. On average, there's about 11 detections per 100,000 active users. So we recommend when it comes to identity attacks, use risk-based conditional access and token protection policies within conditional access. And then again, use non-phishable credentials. You should be moving to things like Windows Hello for Business and FIDO keys. So that's nothing new, but just know that these are some of the trends within the cybercrime arena for the last year.
There's a lot here to unpack with all this ransomware and cybercrime. I want to go back to the very first thing you talked about. 80 to 90% of all successful ransomware campaigns compromises originate through unmanaged devices. That's a huge number. And I think a lot of organizations have this perception that, well, there really aren't unmanaged devices in our environment, or there are very few of them, and we know about them, and we restrict the ability of those to happen. But what I have observed is very few organizations actually go to the length of correlating a required managed device to gain access through the identity platform to like day-to-day services. And it's trivial to do from a configuration and implementation perspective, but it's all of the business process change and the mindset shift and everything else that becomes the hard part. But at least in Microsoft tooling and Entra ID, it's literally a checkbox on conditional access, require a managed device. And then if you've done your homework where you've co-managed all your devices in Windows, your other platform devices are managed by Intune, you can evaluate every single time they come in. Hey, are you managed? Are you compliant with our policies? Come on in. If you're not, then, take a hike. And this is how, again, not that Microsoft is the only way to do things, but this is how we operate our internal environment. To gain access to anything inside of Microsoft today, you have to be on a managed device. But the only thing you can get access to without a managed device is you can get to a Azure Virtual Desktop, I believe, or you can get to a very limited version of Outlook Online where you cannot download attachments. You can view it only in the browser window, and that's it. And so that's a goal that should be a North Star for everyone, because I think there's a gap in perception between where we are and where you actually are. Because if you're saying, well, you can't domain join unless you have admin creds, and we know everyone who's done that, and any device that gets domain joined has our image, there's a lot of assumptions in there, friend. And you don't have technology validating all those things are true. And so that's where I think organizations need to, again, modernize their device management strategy and get to a place where they're looking for that proof that, explicitly verify from the zero trust conversation, the device is managed, the device is compliant. Oh, and by the way, the device is healthy. Let's ask EDR, is the device under threat right now? And so that's 80 to 90% of successful attacks. That already starts shifting the balance in your favor if you do that one thing. Now, admittedly, there's a lot of legwork to get there. I'm not minimizing that. But when I hear about a lot of the wheels spinning at my customers, I don't hear enough of them laser focused on, we are hell-bent on getting to a state where all of our devices are at the minimum co-managed or more with Intune, and we're doing that compliance checking for every single sign-in. I know of almost no one doing this, and it's an 80 to 90% risk reduction. So, a gap in where the efforts are being put in versus the reality of what actually works. Let's see, a couple other things that were interesting here. The 5 foundations of ransomware elimination. So kind of we talked through that with the modern auth with phish resistant creds, least privilege, threat and risk-free, posture management. Okay, so I kind of talked through posture management, at least for end user devices. Andy, you touched on cloud security posture management. Automatic cloud backup, that was the one I really wanted to touch on. And Andy, you called out OneDrive for Business as one option, or you could be a Box customer or a Google Drive customer, or whatever suits your fancy. That's really powerful. And that goes all the way back to an episode we did a while ago, responding essentially to a tweet from Swift on Security. And they had talked about how operational excellence is a cybersecurity tool. If you are operationally excellent in your ability to recover a machine and get it back online, that helps protect you against things like ransomware as well. Because it's you encrypted all the files on the device. So what? I can blow it away. The user gets autopilot. They sign back in. We're going to pull their files back down from OneDrive. And if they're all encrypted on OneDrive, then we'll do a rollback on all the files in OneDrive. And now they're all back to their known good state. The end. Life goes on. And we're not wasting all this effort trying to decrypt or anything else. We just blow it away and reimage because we have all the tools in place to do that. And so that's not only where that cloud backup helps, but having your whole process in place around basically when you get to the point where you don't really care about the files on the endpoint, because they're all automatically backed up in the cloud. Now you're in a way better place and you're not super hung up about it, because if you have to reimage, oh well, no big deal. The last couple of things on the identity attacks, talked about password attacks spiking, but more interesting to me was MFA fatigue becoming a threat. Approximately 6,000 MFA fatigue attempts were observed per day. This is where I've had some customers talk to me, and again, I'm being a little specific, talking about what I know. Microsoft made some changes over the last several months, and we covered them on the show. Changes to the identity platform, to where at first it was, we're going to start defaulting you, or your end users rather, to the strongest authentication method they had registered. So if Andy had a voice phone call, an SMS text message, Microsoft Authenticator app, and a FIDO2 key all registered, next time Andy signed in, it would default and say, hey, give me your FIDO2 key. And Andy could say, well, I don't have it. And they say, okay, well, what do you want to use instead? Authenticator? Hopefully. But it would default to the strongest method. And
which was different than before.
Correct.
Because it used to be, if you signed in once with SMS, it would then default to that last used one.
Correct.
Previously.
It used to default to the previous successful method. Exactly. And so that changed. And then what else changed was we started prompting users, nudging users who were only using phone transport methods. Again, voice, phone call, or SMS. Hey, you should really use the Authenticator app. You should really use the Authenticator app. And those two things combined to essentially create a scenario where a user would register the Authenticator app, and then we'd start prompting for it by default. This is why. I get nobody wants to make changes on behalf of enterprises. It's not something we take lightly. It's something that probably requires a lot of permission getting internally and a lot of vigorous debate. But this is the why. When we see so many customers getting compromised by these, and we have the tools and technologies in place to protect that risk, this is where sometimes our responsibility is to really nudge or push you in that direction. Say, guys and gals, we really need you to do this, because it's going to really help protect your environment. And MFA fatigue, it is a real threat. Things like Authenticator really help because it does that number matching, which was another change that was implemented on behalf of customers a while back. Because remember how it used to just be the push notification. Andy, you just signed in. Do you approve this? Approve or deny? And now today it's, hey, Andy, type the number in on the screen. Do you know what the number is? Well, then you can't do it, right? And it's not even going to present the three options. You literally have to type a 2-digit number. So you've got a 1 in 100 chance of guessing it right, even if you are getting hit with like an MFA fatigue attack. So anyhow, it's my point of all this is to say these threats are real, but we do have tools to help. And in some cases, we as Microsoft have used our position to really help protect customers on their own behalf, because we see these as such tremendous risks, and we see really reasonable ways to mitigate that risk. And as you move forward, continue to look at those phish resistant methods, and looking at protection for token replay, like token protection policies, because Evil Jinx 2 and its ilk, any of those machine in the middle attacks, they're very real. I've had customers getting hit by them in the real world. And if you can prevent or protect against token replay, it really helps. And oh, by the way, a whole bunch of the things we've talked about also help protect against that. If you start doing machine posture checking, you protect against machine in the middle attacks as well. So all of this is a maturity journey. I get it. We're all doing the best we can. But my goodness, when you start hearing these numbers thrown out there and the risk reduction you can put into place by implementing some of these, it makes you go, gosh, are we spending our time on the right things? Or should we pivot our efforts to really focus to where they can make the most benefit? Because there are things you can do. They're not insurmountable challenges to overcome that really, really help.
Okay, so the next section I really wanted to focus on is the critical cybersecurity challenges. And this really is a whole section on IoT and OT security. And there are some alarming things in this section. And really at the end, we'll talk about the call to action, which is almost Microsoft begging customers to pay attention to this. So some of the numbers in IoT and OT. Attacks on targeted open source software have grown on average 742% since 2019. 25% of all OT devices on customer networks used unsupported systems. And this is probably my guess, but it could be like embedded Windows XP, embedded Windows 7. Really, all embedded systems are end of life at this point. Windows IoT for, I can't remember, probably at least the last 5 years. And Windows IoT is on the same support cycle as server. So the current version goes through 2027 for regular support and then extended support through 2032. But operating system is another thing. Like every IoT device and OT device has some sort of system. And right here it says a quarter of them are complete unsupported systems. Of the 78% of IoT devices with known vulnerabilities on customer networks, 46% cannot be patched, meaning the manufacturers just haven't released anything to patch that particular vulnerability. 57% of devices on legacy firmware are exploitable to a high number of CVEs. And by high, the report says more than 10. So more than 10 CVEs that are exploitable on over half of the devices on legacy firmware. And then this is huge here. And this is really the drumbeat of like vulnerability management. Deploying the latest firmware versions available for these PLC models or programmable logic controllers, which are usually the OT devices, could increase the percentage of devices with no known exploitable CVEs from 4% to 40%. So just by deploying the latest firmware, you can increase the security posture of all these OT devices with zero known vulnerability management, zero known exploitable CVEs from 4% to 40%. A huge jump in security across the board just by doing regular patching. Now, understandably, in the beginning, we talked about trying to automate some of the easier stuff like browser updates and OS updates. Really should just be smooth sailing at this point. If you manage iOS or Android devices, literally you can just put the MDE agent on there and prod the user to update their operating system. But OT and IoT devices, understandably, they are not like traditional devices. They don't really have a patch Tuesday. They usually have long patch cycles, and it's not just like simply just applying a patch and rebooting it, especially when it's something that requires like high availability. However, Microsoft notes here that most facilities typically have an annual or biannual maintenance outage window that will allow for the patching. I don't know what the right number is, but I would think that it shouldn't just be a scheduled thing. It should more be dependent on the risk of that vulnerability. So if there's a high risk, a remote, an RCE, some sort of remote exploitable vulnerability, that would value bringing down the particular thing for maintenance faster than your cycle might allow. So if it was me, kind of just spitballing here on vulnerability management, which is typically how most people recommend doing your vulnerability management, is patch the things that are high risk to you. So you can't just like schedule something that's 6 months. If you have something today and your next maintenance window is not for a year, you're going to be exploitable for this vulnerability for almost a year. Like that to me seems a little unacceptable. So, but anyways, that's some insight there, some actionable insight. Implement robust network monitoring within OT environments. I would say the majority of customers that I talk to, and this is probably the same for you, Adam, is most customers don't know what IoT and OT devices they even have on their network. And so just doing this device discovery is huge. If you get a tool, some sort of network tool, we obviously have something called Defender for IoT, which we haven't talked about in length, but there are similar things. That was an acquisition from a company called
CyberX.
CyberX. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were pretty well known in the IoT and OT world, security world. And, there's other solutions out there, but you should get something to do device discovery and then look at abnormal behavior and at least do some vulnerability management to see what version of firmware that you have, what versions of the OS you have, and whether or not you can patch them or not. So some call to action. This statement here, I kind of chuckled when I read it. The significance of maintaining a comprehensive OT patch management system cannot be overstated. While strides have been made to identify and address vulnerabilities within devices powering manufacturing lines and critical infrastructure, this is insufficient. Achieving true resilience necessitates the implementation of a holistic approach to OT risk management, which encompasses asset visibility, patch levels, vulnerability monitoring, and the availability of updates. Through the prospect of interrupting essential processes or requiring recertification may be daunting, the potential consequences of leaving exploitable vulnerabilities unchecked poses a far greater risk, potentially jeopardizing lives and wreaking havoc on critical systems. Organizations must recognize the imperative nature of robust OT patch management systems as an essential component of their overall cybersecurity strategy.
Damn. Mic drop.
Like I said, Microsoft is basically begging customers to pay attention here, because if you are on the critical infrastructure map and you are running OT devices, you need to do patch management. And so it wasn't as clearly stated in last year's. I know there was an IoT and OT device section last year. I don't remember it being laid out this specifically. And so I think as part of the intelligence in the report that's been gathering, they're basically saying, look, this is a huge issue, and if it goes unchecked, it's going to become really bad in the future.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call these ever dry. I think they're actually an engaging read for people in our industry where we already have a vested interest in it. But that was my genuine reaction because I had not reviewed that section yet. So as Andy read it there, that was my first time hearing it. And you don't hear or see that kind of language get used in these reports. Like, that is extremely direct language, like you said, begging people to take a look at this. And let me say one thing. I mentioned earlier in the show, I talked about a couple of Wisconsin companies I had worked with in the past who are manufacturers. I just want to clarify before I make my next statement. I had not covered them for many years. And so the next thing I'm going to say does not apply to them, to be clear, because I don't want to name any companies by name. I will now say that I used to be in our manufacturing org at Microsoft, and I covered a number of manufacturers from a number of different industries. And we had this CyberX acquisition, this Defender for IoT product. And I would go in and talk to security leaders all the time and say, hey, should we come in and talk about this? And not a one of them cared enough to even get like an overview of this industry leading product. And I'm not saying that like, feel bad for Microsoft. I'm just saying there is still such a clear disconnect between cybersecurity leaders and the operational technology networks that they have almost invariably no oversight, no purview over it, no involvement with it at all. It's the business's responsibility. And it's basically clear that they've, in most cases, been given the stiff arm and said, mind your own business. This is the business. And here's us saying, we see this as a massive threat. And we need you to start recognizing how big of a threat this is. And we understand the pain points involved with updating these systems. We know they're different. We understand you're not going to just reboot them regularly. You may have to recertify them. There is pain involved. But there is literally the risk of people dying or critical infrastructure becoming unavailable because we're not addressing these threats. That is way worse than recertifying a thing. when we start talking about people's lives at stake. And I don't know if we're going to solve it anywhere here from the Blue Security podcast perspective, but it is, again, just incredible language here, just really calling out, like, we need you to pay attention. We need you to start looking at this. And again, like, easy for me to say, but I'll just talk about what I know. The Defender for IoT product from Microsoft, that essentially only required like mirroring the OT network from a span port. And at that point, feeding, like, eavesdropping on the network and feeding that telemetry to the solution. You don't have to install any software on any actual OT devices. You don't have to make any configuration changes. It just listens in on the network and says, hey, this controller is talking really weird, or this is running an older version of the software that has known vulnerabilities and you should update it. And none of that impacts or changes anything you're doing in production today. It just gives you more visibility and awareness. And so Andy, it was like I couldn't give that software away. I couldn't get people to even like kick the tires on it. And it just told me, and I covered manufacturers who should be really interested in it. And it just told me we have a long way to go towards integrating this consideration into overall risk and cybersecurity practice at companies, because it is kind of partitioned away as something that's part of operations, part of running the company. It's the COO's purview. And it's basically telling all those nerds over in IT to mind their own business. And I can't even find my words, because it's just such a wild situation. And it never really occurred to me till I put all the pieces together tonight on the fact that this kind of status quo really needs to change. So, if you're a listener and we're kind of mischaracterizing the situation, or there's more insights you'd like to share with us, we'd love to hear them, because I know it's really easy to sit here on this side of the world where you know more of the IT side. Like, how hard can it be to patch stuff? Like, I get it's hard. Like, if you go patch like MRI system, you probably need to like recalibrate it and recertify it and make sure it's not going to kill people and deliver unhealthy doses of whatever it uses to do its imaging. I get all of that. Like, those are serious concerns. But again, like, the risks of that being used and an attacker breaking into it and then doing bad things to humans is really horrible too. So I'll get off my soapbox here, but my goodness, this is a really pointed language here, and I think will get a lot of people's attention. In fact, now I no longer cover manufacturing, but I do cover some critical infrastructure companies. So I'm going to pass this report along to some of my CISO contacts at those and encourage them to read this section in particular. And my initial impression has been the CISOs at these critical infrastructure companies actually have more involvement than the CISOs at manufacturers. That's not a data point. That is just a single observation. So a single anecdote, but for what it's worth.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you talk about OT security and IT security being separate, because there actually is a section in this report talking about creating a unified front and bringing OT and IT security teams together. So, not only just sharing insight, but also developing tools together, strategies and policies, tools for tracking security events, platforms to share real-time collaboration and communication, frameworks and processes and playbooks. And so what you talk about, Adam, where OT and IT are different and sometimes CISOs don't have insight, Microsoft is saying, well, let's collaborate.
Mm-hmm.
Let's bring those teams together, and that will help strengthen your security posture. So there is definitely a call out in the report exactly on what you're talking about, where IT security should get involved and OT security, if they're giving you the Heisman, they shouldn't. Like, it will help protect the company by bringing the two teams together and collaborating together on security.
Absolutely. That's awesome. That's in there. And that's basically what I'm begging to see happen. Is I want to see more of that, because my anecdotal experience to this point has been it's not. They've been treated as two separate things, and there's a lot of lessons that can be learned on both sides. I think the IT folks need to understand more of the needs of operational technology and why it's so different. But at the same time, I think the OT folks could learn that there's a lot of rigor and process the IT folks have created over many years now around managing risk and remediating it with a really process-driven approach. And they could learn something from that too. So would love to see more collab.
And just finally, the last thing I just wanted to touch on, we obviously have talked a lot about Copilot and AI and large language models being involved on cybersecurity, especially with Microsoft. But it is one of the things that I believe Microsoft is leading in the industry on AI-powered security tools. And LLMs, they talked about in here where they think, and by they I mean Microsoft thinks that the majority of applications that are being used today are going to have some sort of LLM capability within the next few years. And I'm seeing it already. Like Adam and I use Riverside to do our recording for podcasts, and they just, for subscribers, implemented AI tools within the suite. Adam uses it to do the transcription of the videos and everything, and there's ways to splice in things. There's a whole editing studio like within the thing now that's all AI powered. And that's just one little podcasting application. I think everything that most users are going to be or have access to are going to have some sort of LLM. But using LLM for security, threat intelligence and analysis, security incident response, being able to find different incidents and break them down for you. I think one of the biggest examples was from Ignite when I was watching this presentation, and the example was if I'm an analyst and I sit down, I can just ask an LLM, Security Copilot, to give me the top 5 incidents that I need to worry about today, that I need to investigate. I don't have to go through a list of hundreds of different incidents. I'm just asking the LLM, who has access to all the data, to do the analysis for me and give me what they think based on all the different signals, severity, users, devices, IP addresses. Okay, what are the 5 top ones that I need to worry about? And let me do some investigation. And I think that's huge, just being able to do it in regular language. So there's all sorts of different reasons to use it. If you're not exploring this in your cyber defense, I think that's going to be something that you're going to be behind the 8 ball. So definitely think about using some sort of AI in your cybersecurity defense, and it calls it out here in the report. Like, this is going to be huge, and it's going to help the industry as a whole.
So we've referenced a couple of times now on this week's show that last week we had Carly Salmon and Megan Maley on and talked about compliance. Well, we also went on their show, Cocktails and Socktails. We'll link it in the show notes if it's published by the time this show has been published. And we had a really good conversation around this subject in particular, because as Andy and Megan both pointed out, the bad guys are starting to use AI for evil. And so part of it is the only way we can respond is by using it for good. And one of the things that I want to be really clear on as well, I regularly listen to Windows Weekly, and Richard Campbell's on the show. And one of Richard Campbell's concepts that he talks about, and I really like this concept, is we say AI for something that doesn't work. And when it becomes a thing, it gets a name. So large language model, as an example. And then Richard also on his other podcast, Run As Radio, had Seth Juarez on from Microsoft. And what they did is really walk through at a technical level how a large language model works. And we definitely should link to that in the show notes because it's an awesome show. But there's a lot of folks who don't really still understand how they work. And so they start saying LLMs can do this and they can do that and they can cure cancer. And LLMs are really good at synthesizing human language, understanding it, generating it, and using human language as an interface to do things or ask for things or make requests. And if you think of a lot of what security analysts do, or other folks in IT engineering functions, being able to either synthesize a bunch of information quickly in natural language or being able to use natural language as an input mechanism is super powerful. And so I think this is not one of those like, oh, LLMs are the answer to everything. But I think in the sense of security operations and cybersecurity, it's something where LLMs are really in the sweet spot. What they do well really helps security analysts. And so this is going to be a force multiplier for good to fight back against the bad guys moving forward.
We're going to both have the full digital defense report as well as the executive summary links in the show notes. Highly recommend that you look through at least the executive summary. And then the two sections for defenders that I think are most interesting are the cybercrime and then the IoT OT section. And then, of course, if you have time, read through the whole thing. It is very comprehensive. There's a ton of stuff in it that we did not even have time to talk about tonight, and we're already close to an hour already on the show. So definitely take a look. I think there's a lot there for people to take advantage of and understand. So that's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter at AJaw0 and Adam at AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.